Hi, everyone. Good evening. Let's go ahead and just get started. So my name is Jess Robinson, and I'm one of the program managers for the Savannah Institute. And the Savannah Institute is a nonprofit organization that works in collaboration with farmers and scientists to develop perennial food and fodder crops within diverse, multifunctional systems grounded in ecology and inspired by the Savannah biome. So tonight, I'm super excited to introduce Harry Hoch. Harry is the co-owner and full-time manager of Hoch and Gardens, which is a diversified fruit orchard located in Minnesota. You can also check out his Pioneer Farm Tour video on our Facebook page. It just came out, as well as our YouTube channel where he and his wife, Jackie Hoch, talk about their operation. And so a little bit about this topic for today. Harry is going to provide an overview of the on-farm project funded by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture demonstration grant. That demonstration demonstrates the potential viability of adding animals to perennial fruit productions. And in this talk, he's going to talk about his farm, the time and materials required to establish the fencing for animals, and also provide a comparison of temporary versus permanent fencing and all kinds of really cool stuff regarding the project in terms of income and costs of raising hogs on pasture. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over so that Harry is the presenter, and then we can go ahead and get started. So just give me a couple seconds.
Okay, it looks like we're ready to start. So as Jess said, I'm presenting on information on the grant that we got from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And they have a grant program called Sustainable Agriculture Demonstration Grants. So not really a research grant, but it helps Minnesota farmers to try out new projects and then share the information. Okay, next slide. I broke the presentation down into sections. So if you get bored and you want to drop out, you can see how far we are through it. But first, I'm going to go over the project or where it was attempted. Then we'll talk about the farm just a little bit. I'll give you a tour of the farm so that you can see how the farm is laid out and the things that we grow and make, to give you a little idea of the perspective of how the animals fit into this and all the products and waste products that we have. Then I'll give an overview of the actual research project. Then we'll talk about hog rotation, income potential of the pastured pork, and then go over the fencing a little bit at the end if I haven't taken too much time. So next slide. So section number 1, where was the project? So this is an aerial photograph of our farm. We're located in the southeast corner of Minnesota, just a few miles from the Mississippi River. So as the crow flies, we're probably less than 5 miles from the bank of the river, but we're facing the west. Let's see. I know it's hard to tell from this aerial photograph, but if you look at the peak of the ridge of my farm over the top compared to the bottom of the valley, that's about a 300-foot difference in elevation. From this picture, it kind of looks like just rolling hills, but these are actually the big, deep valleys and steep bluffs of the coulee region, kind of in the heart of the driftless region. Next slide. So section 2, what do we do? So we're a vertically integrated food production company, and we raise fruit, meat, vegetables. We process, pack, store, sell, and distribute our products. So we have 94 acres on our farm, and on that farm about 40 acres of fruit, 35 acres of woodland, 15 acres of pasture, and then we've always got some land into annuals, whether it's vegetables, which varies year to year, or cover crops, or feed crops. Next slide. So what we grow? Well, apples, vegetables, grapes, plums, raspberries, apricot, strawberries, blueberries, cherries, and there's a few more that I'm sure that I'm missing. Next slide. So here's a satellite photo of the farm. So The top of the farm, the area that's in red with the green spots, that's about 60 acres on top of the ridge. Next slide. So we pack all of the fruit on our farm. These are some pictures of our packing line. Next slide. So some of the products we make on the farm is fresh cider, applesauce, and jellies. Next slide. We also make vinegar. We blend a lot of our fruits, make a lot of different types. Next slide. We also make hard cider. We ferment and bottle on our farm. We make traditional dry apple ciders, but we also make some fruit blends, and we sell in 12-ounce bottles and kegs. Next slide. Here's just a few pictures of our packing facility. We have a large storage area, and you can see the processing kitchen and the cider line, and I guess a couple of our trucks there. Next slide. So now we'll take a tour of the farm. Next slide. So we grow a few cherries. Next, we have high tunnels on the farm, and we grow most of our berries inside the tunnels. Next slide. A lot of raspberries and strawberries are grown inside the tunnel. Next slide. And here you can see some of the cane fruits. And here's a small acre of small planting of blueberries. You can see the deer fence around the edge of that. So if we want to run animals in there, we just have to cordon off that corner. Next slide. We have windbreaks all throughout the farm. Most of the fruit plots have windbreaks on at least two sides. Most of the windbreaks are a combination of spruce and poplar. Some of them are just poplar. Next slide. We have a 2-acre vineyard, mostly wine grapes, but there are some table grapes in there. You can kind of see the terrain of the farm here and the windbreaks on 3 sides of the vineyard. Next slide. We grow plums. You can see they're pretty good sized trees. You see the tall ladders on the right. Next slide. We also grow about an acre of apricots, and apricots are pretty good sized trees. The picture on the left, you can see those rows are 24 feet apart. So those aren't just little bushes. Those are 12, 15-foot tall trees. Next slide. For apples, we have lots of different plantings, quite a few high-density orchards with trellises. Next slide. We also have some large trees left, some semi-dwarfs. There's a few of the great big trees, but on the bottom left you can see that's the fate of most of the big trees on the orchard. They're being cut down for firewood. Next slide. So we do quite a bit of composting on the farm. When the animals are overwintered, all the manure collects along with their bedding, and then we mix that with fresh cut hay in the spring, and we'll make several compost piles, and then that's all that we use for fertility on the farm. Next slide. As you know, we raise some pigs on the farm. You can see one of our portable haulers and some ribbon wire. Next slide. For our poultry, we have portable shelters also. There's a chicken shelter on the left, and on the far right, that's a lower shelter that we use for waterfowl. Next slide. Here's some pictures of one of the portable hog shelters that we built. This system is nice because we can hook up to the tractor and just move it wherever we want in the orchards. Unlike some of the shelters that you drag, we wouldn't be able to get those through the orchards very efficiently. And you can see the ribbon wire around the paddock. Next slide. Just another view and a mix of some of the pigs that we grow. Next slide. So section 4, an overview of the research project, or I should say demonstration project. So the question we attempted to answer: what are the costs and income potential for integrating a silvopasture system into perennial fruit production? So this was not a research project where we're actually testing one specific step in the system, but we're just recording the costs and the income for the entire system, and we're looking at this project as a proof of concept to just see if it looks like this is something worth trying, and if we want to do more research projects in the future, we can try to find out the right number of animals per farm, or the best number of animals to use in a group or rotations. But for this project, it was just an overall, is it going to work? Next slide. So the objectives of the project was first to establish the infrastructure. So we're going to construct fences on the interior of the farm, permanent fences that will create paddocks throughout the system, throughout the farm. We also had planned to install a watering system, but we had lots of problems with this project, more than I could even go into, and there's quite a few things that we intended to do that we didn't get to. We wanted to record and establish production costs, materials and labor to build the fences, and then record the labor it needed to operate the grazing system. So we had lots of clipboards, lots of hours being recorded throughout at least the first 2 years of the project. We also wanted to record the meat that we produced and give an example of the amount of income that we were generating from the hogs on our farm. And after all the project was over, we hope to produce some rough economic data on the cost and income potential of the pastured pork. So this is not, a complete economic analysis of every cost that goes into it and the total income, but just some of the costs related to pasturing pigs. Next slide. So section 5, hog rotation on our farm. Now our system, prior to the project starting, we had a perimeter fence around all of the usable land on the farm, not including the woodland. And that fence was built to keep deer out. So that's a 10-foot tall woven wire fence that makes a good barrier for just about anything coming in and out. Then just inside of that deer fence, we have a pasture fence, an energized fence using high tensile wire. And we created paddocks throughout the orchards by dividing up the fruit plots using temporary or portable fencing. Next slide. So I put this photograph in. This is another satellite photo, but our extension agent used a program to figure out the acreage of all the paddocks that were in the ring pasture. So the yellow area is pastures that we had permanently fenced, and we could move the animals around the outside of the orchard without having to run them through the orchard to get to different plots. Now what we did in this project is built fences on the windbreaks, and you can see the dark colored greenish lines throughout. Those are all windbreaks throughout the whole farm, making more than a dozen different fruit plots. And we put fencing on those windbreaks so we'd have permanent paddocks and not have to run as much portable fencing. And most of the paddocks run around 4 acres, some a little less. There's a few that are 2 acres. Next slide. Here's just an example of the energized ribbon wire. Next slide. I put this in just to give an example. You can see on the left what this one block of trees looked like the fall that we took these pictures. There was a lot of apples that fell onto the ground. That's what it looked like before the pigs, and on the right is what it looked like after the pigs. And with running pigs in fruit plots, the key is to manage them carefully, watch them all the time, because you can time their moves so that they'll just eat the dropped fruit before they start rooting in the soil. Next slide. So the labor records for the first 2 seasons. Now in year 1, as I said earlier, we had a permanent perimeter fence, and then we created paddocks by setting up ribbon wire or mesh fence and then taking it down each time we had to move the animals. And what we found over time is not only is it really time consuming, but if we have to get into the block fairly quickly for a pest control spray, or if we want to run a tour through there or do the mowing, before we do anything, all the animals have to be rounded up and out, and then all the fencing has to be collected and taken out. So you can't just open a gate and call them out when you're using portable fencing. And on year 2, we had all of the windbreaks fenced, so we've used a lot less time setting up and taking down fences. Well, we did have the woven wire up, but we weren't able to get to putting in the corners and the gates. So there were long runs of woven wire, but then they weren't connected. So every time we moved the animals, we'd have to put up a few feet of fencing, make sure there was power to it, and then move the animals in. Next slide. So we did get a reduction of time from year 1 to year 2. So you can, the comparison is not exact because we had a different amount of animals and a different number of moves the 2 years, but I did break it down to the average time for the entire season for pig, and then the average time per pig per day. So the average time per pig per day, the difference, 0.023 hours versus 0.028 hours, doesn't look like very much, but that's all of the pigs times every day. So that adds up quite a bit. Section 6, income from the hogs. Now we use pretty much all heritage breed, and then we were all crossing the breeds. We weren't using purebred offspring as our feeders, but hybrids between these different types of animals. So we tried a variety: Ossabaw Island, Mulefoot, Guinea Hog, Mangalitsa, Gloucestershire. And all of these old breeds, they grow slowly, but they require minimal feed. It takes us about a year to grow them to butcher size, and then they're only about 150 pounds. But they require very little supplemental grain during the season. And the picture on this slide is a pile of apple pumice that came from the cider press. And you can see they're all going after the pumice like it was a pile of grain. And when we processed our animals, we sold them in 2 ways: retail of processed cuts or custom slaughter. Next slide. So this is a breakdown of the animals that we had butchered and cut into regular butcher shop type of cuts, the price that we charged retail, selling on the farm or selling at the farmer's market. And as you can see, this is a total of 3 hogs, all the meat that was produced from it, the processing cost. And after the processing, we netted $1,600 or $534.29 per hog. Next slide. So to compare the revenue, when we sold custom slaughter, and for those of you that aren't familiar with that, a customer will order a pig, and they will pay us the live weight for the pig. So we charge $3 per pound, and then they give the cutting orders to the processor, and they pay the processor directly. So when we sold animals this way, a 140-pound hog got us $420. Seems like quite a bit less per animal, but there's a lot less time and energy into this. The retail, we have to store the meat, so we have to have a lot of freezers. Then we take the cuts to the farmer's market and sell off of the farm. Sometimes we would make deals on packages of meat, but some cuts sell really slowly, or some don't sell very fast at all. Right now I've got quite a few packages of pork liver in the freezer, but the puppies like that. On the custom slaughter, there's no storage cost. You just transport the animal, you get paid right away, and you're not stuck with any meat or any leftovers after a year or two of selling the cuts. Next slide. As I said before, we're just looking at the cost of pasturing the animals. There's a lot of other costs to consider. The price of the feeders, or if you're farrowing your own pigs, there's a lot of fees, costs with that. Supplemental feed, that will vary from farm to farm. What we did, we got grain from another hog farm, but we bartered for it. They took finished vinegar from us that they fed to their animals, and then we took bags of grain from them, so no cash exchanged. Another supplement that we had was waste colostrum from an organic dairy farm. They would only leave the calves a day with their cows, and then milk off the colostrum for a couple of days, and then they would normally just throw that away. But we'd pick it up every few days and feed that mostly to the younger pigs. Then our commercial kitchen, all throughout the summer, there's a lot of different products being made. We have a woman working with us making sauerkraut and kimchi and some other canned vegetables, so there was always trimmings from that, pumice from the cider press, and then also waste cider from when we ferment the ciders into, or ferment the apple juice into hard cider. And in that process, there's a lot of filtering and racking. Or racking is moving it from one container to the next. So you're letting it settle out, and then you rack off 90% of it, and that will leave a few gallons of cider in the bottom of the tank. And there's alcohol in the cider, but there's also dead yeast with lots of vitamins and fiber from the parts of the apple that was in suspension and then settled out. So a lot of good nutrients for the animals in that waste cider. And if you give them too much, they get to have a little party. Try to give it to them on Friday nights. The other thing, winter feeding, winter shelter, and then of course transportation to the processor. These are all costs you'll have in addition to the pasturing. But like I said, each farm is going to have different price for all of these costs. But there are also things that you can figure out pretty easily. You know what you pay for the feed. You know how much it costs to take them to the processor. But it's been really hard to find any information on what you're actually spending on pasturing hogs. So hopefully this project will help some people make decisions on if they're going to pasture animals, or how many, and how much they want to invest into it. Okay, next slide. Section 7, the fencing. Now just to review, in year 1, we had a perimeter fence with high tensile wire that was energized, and that enclosed about 50 acres of fruit. And then the paddocks were created by movable energized fencing. That was ribbon wire and energized mesh. Year 2, we added woven wire to the windbreaks. So it was a pretty easy project to put up, especially when we had a lot of extra labor at the end of apple season. So in year 1, we had a nice fall, quite a few days of good weather after apple harvest, so we used our harvest labor to put up several thousand feet of fencing on the windbreaks. But then in year 2, we didn't have the gates installed, and we didn't have all the corners and the completed sections where the windbreaks ended. And then the plan was that year 3, we would finish all the paddocks, install the gates, and install the water lines, and then record how much time it took to pasture the animals and rotate them with all permanent fencing. But we weren't able to get all of that finished, so the project is just giving us the information from the first 2 years of fencing. Next slide, please. So for our project, we put in an extra 5,000 feet of fencing on the interior of the farm, creating about 12 paddocks. They averaged about 4 acres each. We spent $3,000, $3,118 on the materials to do that, and spent about 120 hours setting that up. Next slide. So I just put this photo in again, just to point out again of how we created all of these fences. So all of the green, dark green lines are the windbreaks, and you can see how long those are and how much fencing we actually put in. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, the time and costs that we used in our project is a lot lower than somebody starting from scratch. So I took the costs, the price of materials from when we started the project in 2015, and put together a few examples of what it would cost to create fencing from scratch. So since most of my plots were 4-acre paddocks, in order to start from scratch, you'd need about 840 feet of woven wire, 4 corners, and we use H braces, so that's 2 posts in the ground and then 1 at the top, causing and making the H. And then we use high tensile wire at an angle and then crank that tight and makes a real strong corner or a dead end. Then I figured you'd have 2 gates in this paddock, 10-foot one for equipment and a 4-foot gate just to move animals from out of the paddock. The woven wire is 45 cents a foot. The posts were $9 a piece. The gates, $50 and $100. So to create that 1 4-acre plot, we would have used $1,700 worth of materials. Next slide, please. So I also put together a scenario of putting a perimeter fence around a 50-acre plot. Since 50 acres is about what we did, and it's a nice number as far as a lot of small farms should have 50 acres. So for this fence, we needed 3,000 feet of wire to go around a square 50-acre block, 4 corners, 2 H braces using 5 posts per corner, 1 entrance gate using 2 10-foot panels. So if you make a gate around your entire farm, you need a big gate to get tractors, wagons, trucks through, so that would be a 20-foot gate. The cost of the materials for 2015 is about $1,300 for the wire, about $3,000 for the posts, and you can see the gates, gate hardware, miscellaneous, for just about $5,000 to put a perimeter fence around the farm. So what I would suggest is if you do have the funds, is to do the perimeter first, and then you can, even if you use woven wire on the perimeter, you can add 1 line of high tensile wire with an insulator, and then that'll give you an electric source all around the farm. So you can have 1 energizer on that top wire, and then you can make your temporary paddocks by charging the woven wire just by connecting it to that 1 top wire on your woven wire fence. And this way you can build your fence over time, improve your paddocks, reduce your labor. So every year you could add a few more. And then you saw the price of a paddock. Obviously, your next year's paddock you'd have one less fence to put in, or the first paddock you wouldn't have all four sides to do if you had your perimeter, and then each paddock you can make with some with just one side or two sides depending on the setup of your farm. And with these materials, with this material cost list here, you could be able to fairly easily figure out what the cost of that adding the paddocks are each year. And having woven wire on the perimeter, I highly suggest. You really need a fence that the animals can't get through. If the power goes off or if some animal scares them, they'll run right through an electric fence. And another thing to keep in mind is some of these old breeds of hogs are very thrifty and can survive in the wild. And some of the DNR personnel are very skeptical of these animals. And if you ever get any out, they might come and visit you. They might tell you you can't raise those in their area. So my suggestion is have a very tight fence on your perimeter, and then always keep track of your animals. So if somebody did complain and they came to visit you, you could say, here's the list of every animal that was farrowed and where I sold it, and just prove that you've never lost an animal. And that would probably help with a discussion with the DNR. Okay, next slide. So the project conclusion. Is it economically feasible to integrate animal production into a perennial fruit operation? So after doing this project and looking at all of the costs, I think there is potential to make this work. Of course, the more fencing you put in, the less labor you have, the more quickly you can move the animals, and the less chance of having damage to your main crops. You need to figure out the right balance for each farm. What's right for me is not necessarily going to be right for every farm. But as I said before, I think you should begin with a perimeter fence and then add more fencing over time. So I guess that wraps up the PowerPoint. If we want to answer some questions, we can move on to that.
All right, yeah. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to open up the, you can put it in the chat box, and you can also have your mic available for it. So just give me a second. Also, thank you, Harry, for such a great talk. I think it was really cool to see you break that down and see, if you're doing 50 acres and you're trying to fence it, how much can it cost, and this is the labor and the time. I think those things can be overwhelming if you don't know where to start. So thank you so much. I'm just going to open up the questions. All right, so if anyone has any questions, just post it in the chat box, or, we got a question in the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and open that up.
Wait, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Hey, it's Kim. Hi, Jeff.
Hello. Good to hear from you again.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. I'm in the process of trying to put together my own fruit-based perennial silvopastoral hog system. So that was very useful. And I guess I'm wondering, I have a lot of questions, but in terms of which areas or which fruit trees the pigs were visiting, did you notice them having any particular preference for certain fruits, or are they just like anything at all that's sweet and tasty?
Well, what I found is if the pig is hungry, it's going to eat anything.
Right.
And in our system, we have to watch the animals very closely. And what we found also after years of working with pigs is we found out that they're lazy. And They will always go for the easiest food source first. So if we're rotating them into blocks that have already had their harvest and they're gleaning fruit, they will go and clean up every piece of fruit that's on the ground. And then once they clean up all the fruit, the next thing that they like best is clover flowers. So we'll also rotate animals through. Even pigs get a lot of nutrition from a mixed pasture. If we put pigs in an orchard that's got clover in bloom, they will go through and chew off every flower. So within a half a day, the field was purple. Then it's just green by the end of the day. After they eat the flowers, then they work towards mostly the legumes they like, clovers, white clover. After that, they'll chew on the forbs and some of the grasses. Once they've chewed that down or had enough of it, then they'll start to root a little bit. And in our orchards, we cultivate lightly under the trees. So the next thing they go for is the loose ground. They're not going to go in the sod in the aisles. They'll go for the loose ground under the trees first, because that's the easiest to get through. And then once they've gone through that, and they're still hungry, then they'll start digging holes and flipping over the sod and doing damage to your orchard floor. So kind of a long answer to a short question, but they'll just keep working. The other thing to keep in mind is if you really want your hogs to get their nutrition from the pasture and from the fruit, first thing, you don't want to wring their noses, because that's what they need to do their shallow rooting. And the other thing is to limit their grain. Some of these don't need grain at all. Others need supplement, and maybe feed them the grain at the end of the day, so they're hungry in the morning and eating what's available in the field all day long, then have a little bit at the end of the day. But as far as a preference for fruits, our farm is broken up into different blocks. So if they're going into the strawberries after strawberry harvest, that's all that there is. And then from there we go to raspberries, and the raspberries finish up, then we can go to the apricot block when they're done, and from there the plums, and then from there the early apples start. So we just keep rotating them through the harvest, following what's ripe and what's finished.
Interesting, thank you. And how often? Well, I guess you mentioned that you're moving them very often in order to avoid damage to the trees. But I'm just wondering if you had incidences of damage anyway, and roughly how often you were moving them.
Well, in this system, there's really no way that I can give you a timing, because we're talking about different sized animals. Early on, they're really small, and you can have a lot more animals per acre, or they can stay on the acreage longer. When they're getting close to slaughter, and you've got 120, 130 pound pigs, they can do a lot really fast. For the trees, they do very little damage to the trees. I have seen some athletic pigs jump up on their back feet and pull apples down and chew some limbs off. But they usually don't damage the trees very much, but they will turn over the soil. And if you leave them in a block too long, they will really start turning over the sod. And in some blocks, I've left them in the fall post-harvest and let them completely till the entire orchard floor, so it looks like it was roughly disked. And then after I pull the animals out, I have a 9-foot disc that I can pull down my 15-foot orchard rows, and I can actually disc a field quicker than I could have mowed it. And then the orchard is pretty smooth, and it's been lightly worked up. But you just have to watch. You can't just put your animals in a plot and leave them there. You have to check them a couple times a day. If it's smaller plants like raspberries and strawberries, with apple trees, you want to check them at least every day. with raspberries, if you leave them in too long, they will start turning over the raspberry plants and eating the raspberry roots. But you wouldn't want to leave them in that long, and unless you have a weed problem and you're really trying to knock down a lot of weeds. But the timing is all by observation. Size of the animal, how much grass there is, what the quality of the pasture is, and how much fruit there is for them to glean.
And with the smaller fruits, when they were in there, say, with raspberries or blackberries, I mean, is that post-harvest and they're just eating what's on the ground, or are they able to forage berries directly off the bushes?
Yeah, we put the animals in mostly post-harvest. With some of the late crops like apples, they might go in June or July when the apple trees are going through their natural June drop. Or if we're going in and hand thinning, we can pull off the damaged apples, throw it on the ground, and then when we're done with that, we can flash graze the pigs through quickly to eat up the apples. But with raspberries and strawberries, you've already harvested everything out, but there might be a bunch that fell on the ground at the end of the harvest. They will definitely find those raspberries, and they will be running around through the bushes and going through the rows. So if there are ripe fruit, like raspberries that haven't fallen off yet, they're probably going to get knocked off by the pigs. And they will reach up and take fruit off if they've gotten everything on the ground and grazed all the grass they want.
Excellent, thank you. I was looking at your webpage a little bit, and you talk about pigs interrupting the pest cycle by removing that fruit or disturbing the soil. And I'm wondering, I know it would be anecdotal, but have you observed, say, any decline in apple pests or fruit pests in the areas where you've had them?
Well, I haven't done any controlled studies where part of the block is grazed and part of it isn't. And pest levels are different every year, so I can't really say that the animals have reduced my codling moth infestation by 15% or anything like that. There have been some research projects. The Michigan State University has done quite a few studies with animals, and they would, for example, study plum curculio and see if they have a reduction with randomized plots throughout a field. They've also done it with codling moth, and I think some were even trying to see if it had an effect on apple scab. But the simple answer is, obviously, they reduce the pests if they break the pest cycle. And things like apple maggot and codling moth, those pests, to complete their life cycle, they have to go through their larval stage in the fruit. Then most of them will leave the fruit after the fruit falls on the ground and pupate in the soil or in the ground cover right on top of the soil. And if the pig eats the apple before the pest finishes its larval stage, then that pest is gone. So it's one of many tools that we have to use in organic production.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really fascinating.
All right, do we have any more questions? Those are really good questions, Kim. I'll give you guys a minute or so. If you have questions, jump in. If not, we can call it a night.
I could also mention that I put this information together in a little article, and I did send it to Jess, so it'll be available through the Savannah Institute. I'll try to get it up on my website. On my website, I've got a lot of papers or articles that I've written over the years on food production, but I'll put this one up too eventually. But there's a lot more detailed information on, especially on the fencing, and a little bit more on what we did with the timing of the animal, the time that we spent maintaining the animals. So a lot more detail in the paper than what I put in these few PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, and I'll definitely be sending that article along in the email when I post the video of this recording and everything, so you guys will have a chance to see that. All right, I guess it looks like we're good. Thank you so much, Harry, for an awesome talk. I feel like I've learned a lot about pigs and what they like to eat. I didn't think about when they finished up eating all the fruit that you've watched them eat clover and kind of go through these different eating patterns. And you have like a really good attention to detail, so it's really cool to hear that and learn of your experience. And so thank you everyone for joining. And yeah, I'll be following up in a little bit with all this wonderful information and the link to the video. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, I'm logging out.